Hello everybody! So are you already using canonical links for your SEO strategies? This is Stef from Samayas and welcome to my channel. So this video is part of a series of SEO strategies, wherein we look first at the definition of what we can do and then dig in with .NET. As you can see, I'm already an old sailor in the web field. Until recently, I thought I knew why I needed or didn't need to use canonical links in my web pages. Well, boy, was I wrong. You see, my supposition was that in the old days I only needed to use those to indicate duplicated or different URL access points to the same page, like page ID ?1 or like page my/1, etc. So in essence, having the same pages with different URLs. Well, these days, unfortunately, it has become a little bit more nuanced. Canonical links have evolved into a strategic tool for managing complex content ecosystems. And here, we're talking about content syndication partnerships to cross-domain authority consolidations to API-driven pages. So from very simple websites to very complex sites. And of course, with AI searches around the corner, they will be using those as well. Google and other search engines now use canonicals to understand content relationships across our entire web presence and not just any more duplicated pages. This helps the search engines to decide which versions to serve the power ranking. That might be from a very simple website to a multilingual website to websites which offer different regional content. So without any canonical implementation, your website is basically fragmented and your ranking becomes diluted compared to sites who do use canonical linking. So today, I'll dig in how you can implement canonical URLs in your .NET Core ASP.NET website. Of course, the principle is mainly the same thing if you use other technologies. In essence, the only thing what matters is the outputted HTML. So let's dig in. So as you can see, I've created a very simple ASP.NET MVC application called Simple Canonical. Let's first have a run and let's see what's modified. And I've added some logo, I added my company name, I still have my home and my privacy. And next to that, I added 3 new pages, an article page, a blog post page, and an about page. Very simple. Now under my www root, I added some dummy images, and then I still have a very simple home controller. And next, I've added 3 methods. I have my article method, I have my blog post method, and I have my about post method. And this sample continues the previous samples about basic SEO settings. Next, I created a view models directory. Thereunder, I have a basic view model, which currently has a constructor which takes title, meta description, and keywords, which were already seen in previous videos. I have my home view model, which inherits from the base view model, and I still have my error view models. Technically, you could do without those, since we are still in the quote-unquote simple method. Now let's dig into our CHTML files, and if you go to the about, I created a section, link canonical, where I specified explicitly my link rel canonical and the href, which is my local host, my home controller, and my about method. And since canonical links are unique for each page, of course, in each of those pages, I can just add those. If I go to my article page, same thing, I reference my home article. If I go to my blog post, I reference my home blog post. If I go to my index, I reference my home index. And then if I go to my privacy, I reference my home privacy. And so as you can see, for a very simple project, this might just be what you need. Of course, this is only part of the solution. Now each of those pages contains a section. Now we need to modify our layout to include those sections. And so now if we go to the final layout page, well, I added a render section, link canonical, which is set required false. So you might include it on the pages you need it, but not necessarily on all pages. If we go to the error page, I did not include it, and if my layout would have been required, then I would have had an error. Now whether or not my error page doesn't need that link, that's something else. Normally an error page is not something which should be accessible and or used in normal scenarios. And so if you have a further look, you can still see that my description is coming from my meta description, that my keyword is coming from my keyword, that the keywords are coming from model keyword, and that the title is coming from model title, which was seen in a previous video. And other than that, this is just a sample with no modification. Very simple, right? Now, of course, canonical is hidden, and so we don't see anything on the page. We just need to do view source. And here we can see we have an extra link, rel canonical, with our local host, home, index. If I go to my blog post and I request a source, it's home blog post. Now, of course, for those who are paying attention, my URL is localhost 7078, which is not really internet accessible. And so depending on your situation, you might just enter HTTPS localhost 7078 and you might replace it with your site name. If you only have one site, that might just be enough. If not, let's go to the next section. So now I've created a new project based on my simplified canonical, which I've called now Modelized Canonical. For those of you who are paying attention, in my previous sample, the site URL was hard-coded. In a lot of scenarios, that might just be okay. In a lot of corporate environments, however, a website might be presenting itself as www.something, but then you might have a staging environment, a testing environment, and a development environment. And each of those environments have a unique URL and should be correctly addressed. Of course, there's always the question of whether or not search engines like Google and others should be able to access a development, a testing, and a staging environment. But that's another discussion. From a point of view of a developer, having the right URL in your website is important. And of course, this principle applies to canonical, but in general this principle might apply to a number of other settings and features which represent themselves along your website. So in this project, the first modification I did was create a new models directory, and under the models directory I created a model called canonical model, which will contain all our information related to our canonical. So in here I created two constructors. I have a default constructor and I have a canonical model constructor which takes two parameters, a site URL and a subpart. The site URL, of course, is our www or staging or testing or something. And the subpart is our home/index, home about, etc. And then we have three properties. The first property has canonical, defines whether or not our canonical should be enabled or not. As you can see, our default constructor doesn't set a value and so by default is false. And only our canonical model has a true property. And then finally we have a public function which creates a URI which concatenates the site URL and the subpart to create a valid URI. So if we create a model, at some point we need to use that. Hence, we have our base view model. And in our base view model, I've made the following modification. I have my title, my meta description, and my keywords, and I've added a nullable canonical model as a variable. I've also added an extra property, so it's accessible. Next, of course, I've modified my home view model, which inherits from my base view model, and which does receive canonical as a parameter and passes it along to the base. Depending on the complexity of your site, this is just a sample, you might have a multitude of view models. In this scenario, currently I haven't even bothered to have our view model inherit from my base view model, but I might and then still pass canonical as null. The next modification, for each of those CSHTMLs, I've removed the section link canonical. And so it's gone. So how do I get my link canonical now on my page? Well, very simple. In my layout, instead of having a section, I have a little bit more code. First, something I've already introduced in previous videos, I have a model, which is my base view model, and it already uses meta description, keywords, title, etc. And so now, instead of having a section, the first important line is the link rel canonical, and I've added that in a conditional statement. If my canonical is null or is false, well, in my HTML, I won't output this. And so again, our canonical model, if it's null or if it's empty, my has canonical is false. And then I've added some code to pre-process the data. First, I build my boolean has canonical. I check if my model has an has canonical model. If it has, it returns value. If it hasn't, by default, it's false. And then next, my canonical URL. If I have a has canonical, will retrieve the build canonical and output that in our page. Pretty simple, right? And of course, our final modification is that somehow I need to build my new type of base view model. And now, in our home controller, everything comes together. We've previously modified our home view model, which has an extra parameter, and now, wherever we need a canonical model, we just pass a new canonical model with our site URL and the string which is needed for our subpart of our canonical. Pretty easy, right? Now the good thing is that everything is regrouped per controller. However, keep in mind that this is just a sample to show you the possibilities. In real life, a lot of those strings might be coming from some configuration database or something else, but might be dynamic and might not necessarily be hard-coded. Next, as you can see, my home controller is not inheriting from controller anymore, but is inheriting now from our web controller, which is a base class which I've created. And in my web controller, in here, I've created 3 private variables, our logger, my controller name, and my controller short name. And in my constructor, I retrieve the controller name, I store the logger, and I build my controller short name to remove controller. In essence, to on the fly build the name of my controller and not having to hard code it. If you go back to our home controller, currently home is hard coded here. And if we can automate that, of course, that's better. And so by shortcutting and building our controller short name, of course, we can do that. The next property, and here again is for demo purposes, I have in my base controller site name, and site name here is hard-coded to my local host. But again, it's a way to show of what is possible, and logically, this information should be coming from a app.json or some other configuration database specifying in what environment your website is running. And so our site URL is hard-coded here, but on the fly is inserted here. And the final important method is our getAction name. And in a lot of scenarios, our getAction name is the name of the method or the action we're calling. I think that in 99% of the scenarios, our controller context route data action will have that variable. But there will be scenarios where you might have tweaked your URLs and the way to react it, and that might not necessarily be okay. So again, that'll depend on what you're doing. And so the final result would be more looking like something like this. Our first parameter is still the site URL. The second parameter is a concatenation of our controller short name and our getAction method name. And if I now put a breakpoint and I run my privacy, as you can see, it's built automatically /home/privacy. And so we don't even need to hardcode things. And of course, if again we look at the output, everything looks normal. Link, rel, canonical, localhost, home, privacy. So as you can see, this opens up a lot of possibilities. This is just an example. Of course, you can integrate this in other objects, you can include other information that you require, etc., etc. As always, depending on the complexity of your website, there's never a right solution. I just went through a number of possibilities to implement easily canonical links in your website. If you guys enjoy this content, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell sign. Or leave a comment down below.